Welcome to this how-to video for the How to Learn Catalan ebook. So in this video I'm going to show you how to get the most out of the ebook and also cover the fundamental principles for language learning so that you can get off to a great start with learning Catalan. So we'll start by going to the table of contents, and you'll notice straight away that it's very detailed and numbered and arranged into parts, chapters, sub-chapters and sections, and this is what enables you to use the How to Learn Language guides in a very flexible way. You can read it from cover to cover, use it as a follow-along, which I'd recommend doing, but if, for example, you're not a big fan of reading, for instance, then you can use it as a reference tool instead. And yeah, the format you see here enables you to very clearly see where everything is and means you can just dip in and out of the book as you see fit. So before we go through each part of the guide in more detail, I'd just like to talk about, on the top left here we've got how to use this guide, which we're covering now. Why I started How to Learn Languages, which is basically just in case it's interesting or useful for you to read about my experiences learning languages and how this has shaped my approach to learning languages. But you don't have to read that part, that's just in case it's helpful for you. And then we've got defining fluency. Now the reason I've included that, and think it's worth briefly mentioning here, is because sometimes when people talk about fluency, they think of being able to use the language like a first language speaker, but actually that's proficiency, a level above fluency. With fluency you'd still be very comfortable with the language and could understand the vast majority of what you listen to and read, and can speak without having to pause for much thought, for example, but it's still a level below that of a first language speaker. Now, if you follow the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, I guess fluency would be around the B2 level, perhaps high up in the B2 level, as it's acknowledged to be quite a broad level. And then proficiency would be C1, certainly C2. Now, there are 5 key parts to the guide. These are, number 1, the overview, introduction to Catalan, settling in, the path to fluency, and what next. Now we also have tutorials at the end, but this is more like an add-on for just useful bits of information as and when you need them. Now, we'll go through each of these parts in more detail shortly, but first I'd like to cover the overview in more detail, because in the overview you learn about the fundamental principles for language learning and how to apply some of these to learning Catalan. Some of the more controversial aspects of language learning and how these relate to learning Catalan. For example, how to go about learning grammar. We cover that in 1.2, How to Learn Catalan. But to keep it brief now, if you enjoy studying grammar in isolation, by all means do so as an add-on to the rest of the process. If you don't enjoy studying grammar in that way, that's absolutely fine, you don't have to. You will naturally improve your understanding of grammar during the rest of the process, and we'll get into that shortly. Now, the reason I want to cover how to learn languages, i.e. the fundamental principles of language learning now, is because it will give you a great start for learning Catalan, and it will also give you a much greater understanding of how this guide has been structured. For example, it's structured in a way for you to get the most out of these fundamental principles, to make the process as effective and enjoyable as possible. And with all this in mind, regardless of how you want to use this guide, for example, if you want to use it as a reference tool, I'd still recommend reading the overview, because as I said, it will give you a really solid foundation, solid understanding of the key principles for learning any language. So to go into those now, in the overview part, we see that there are 3 key pillars for learning any language, and these are passive learning, active learning, and practice. Now, passive learning, fortunately, is arguably the most important element and also the easiest element to incorporate into our daily routines, simply because it is, as it says, passive. And this basically involves just immersing in Catalan as often as you can. And because it's passive, you can attach it to things you already do, such as your commute to work, cooking, cleaning, exercise, just about anything you can think of where you don't have to be concentrating on what you're listening to. So A key thing to keep in mind with passive learning is that you should be immersing in content that Catalan speakers would listen to or watch, for example. So that means, it needs to be, for example, Catalan series and films, Catalan podcasts, Catalan radio, that first language speakers would listen to. In Barcelona, when they're having breakfast at home, when they're listening to the radio, that sort of thing. It needs to be Catalan in its undiluted, natural form. And, if you're wondering, why would I do that if I can't understand any of it at the start of the process? Well, that's exactly why you should do it. Because the sooner you expose your brain to the sounds and sound patterns of Catalan, the sooner you'll become familiar with them. So, you should start doing that immediately and do it as often as you can. And fortunately, as mentioned, because you can attach it to various different parts of your day, it's actually fairly straightforward to accumulate many hours listening to the language in a fairly short space of time. So, with passive learning, there's just one more thing worth mentioning, and that is the notion of comprehensible input. Now, I don't mention it because I think it's something worth thinking about in terms of language learning, but I mention it because you'll often come across it on YouTube these days. It's become a very popular kind of buzz term, and it's very misleading, really. Not deliberately misleading, but I notice even the people giving the advice about comprehensible input are at times a bit misguided in terms of what it entails and stuff. So to explain, comprehensible input is essentially the idea of using materials or resources for which you can understand the majority of that material. So for example, it could be stuff where you understand 70, 80, 90% of the material, and the logic behind it is that if you can understand the majority of it, the small part you can't understand will be fairly easy to figure out because of your understanding of the rest of it, because of that context. Now, in and of itself, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this concept. It makes sense, it's not incorrect. However, it's not really helpful to think in those terms when it comes to language learning. And that's because, the word input, incomprehensible input, I often see, it leads people, and even the people giving the advice, it leads them to think that they should be immersing in Catalan or, immersing in a language with resources where they can understand a fair amount of what's being said. And the reason I wouldn't recommend thinking in these terms is because, especially when you're starting out learning a language and before you reach a level where, you'll understand the majority of content that Catalan speakers would listen to, before you get to that stage, if you're thinking in terms of having to immerse in comprehensible input, then you're not going to immerse in content that Catalan speakers would listen to. And immersing in content Catalan speakers would watch or listen to is absolutely essential for developing your fluency in Catalan and understanding Catalan as it's spoken by first language speakers. So I'd recommend thinking of your passive learning as something completely separate, only immersing in content Catalan speakers would immerse in or watch or listen to. So, and just as a final thing, your passive learning is something to continue throughout the process. Now, comprehensible input can have its uses when we come to active learning, and we'll touch on that shortly. But basically, active learning is when you strip it down, it's basically just learning new phrases, learning new sentences. And for that reason I call it sentence collecting. You'll see it given other names like chunking, sentence mining, various other names you'll have probably come across at some point, but they all boil down to this same thing, which is learning new phrases, learning new sentences. Now, on the most basic level or basic form of doing this, you can literally just go to YouTube, find videos which list phrases in Catalan and note them down, say them aloud to yourself and practice saying them with or typing them with Catalan speakers in conversation. That's absolutely fine if you enjoy following that fairly simple approach to it. If you find it a bit boring and want to make it a bit more interesting, a bit more engaging, then you can do something I call active listening and reading, which basically is just still doing active learning, doing sentence collecting, but with materials and resources that either Catalan speakers would use in their daily life or that have been designed for people learning Catalan in an interesting way. And for instance, that's where comprehensible input can be useful if you come across it. For instance, if you come across something that's marketed or labelled as comprehensible input. I wouldn't go near it for your passive learning, but for active learning it could be useful because it will likely be arranged in a tiered level of progression for you to work through, which can be nice for motivation and so forth. And as long as you're still able to learn new phrases, learn new sentences during that, then that's great. And likewise, on a broader point with active learning, beyond those key things I've mentioned, there aren't really any rules to follow in terms of what you use for your active learning and how you do your active learning. As long as it's, using mediums and methods you enjoy, and it's on topics you're interested in and that are relevant to your life, and that enable you to, collect sentences, collect phrases, or learn sentences, learn phrases, then that's fine. So this can be, subliminally or very deliberately. And what I mean by that, for example, is when actively learning Vietnamese, for instance, I kept a notebook, and in that notebook I would often write out the transcripts of YouTube videos which were vlogs via a Vietnamese speaker about daily life in Vietnam, Vietnamese culture and so forth. And when I did that, I didn't literally make a separate page where I noted down the phrases or sentences I was collecting. Instead, just the process of writing out the transcript and paying attention to the new phrases, the new sentences, and subliminally sort of taking them in that way, I felt was enough. And that still proved very effective. However, you can also be more deliberate about it and literally keep a note of all the phrases you're collecting, sentences you're collecting, on a spreadsheet, in a notes app, whatever you prefer, or a notebook, for instance. So yeah, just base it on your personal preference. As long as you're picking up new phrases and sentences, be it subliminally or more deliberately, that's grand. Now, in terms of how to remember what you're learning during your active learning, we'll cover shortly various memory techniques you can use, but these memory techniques are a supplement to the process. The key way to remember what you learn is to practice with Catalan speakers, and that's because, for learning and remembering most things, the most effective way is to use it or apply it. And the most natural and authentic way to do that with language learning is to practice with first language speakers. So that's one of the reasons practice is such a fundamental part of the process. It's because it enables you to apply, to use the phrases you've been learning during active learning and helps you remember them. Another reason it's a fundamental part of the process is that, stating the obvious a bit, by having conversations with Catalan speakers, you will get better at having conversations in Catalan with Catalan speakers. Now, another reason it's a fundamental part of the process is that, people sometimes obsess a little bit about, the idea of becoming fluent or reaching fluency. And, if that's something that's very important to people, then practice is how they do that, really. That, every part of the process contributes to it, but the part where you really forge your fluency is through practice with Catalan speakers. Now, for example, if you, just as an arbitrary figure, were to chat with, have conversations with, say, 50 Catalan speakers over the first month or two of the process, there's a strong chance through each of those conversations, at least the start of each conversation will involve very similar phrases, the same phrases, such as about, how they're doing, how was work, how their day was, that sort of thing. And in that process of repeatedly using those phrases, they will become automatic for you, to the point where, in future, when you have conversations in real life with Catalan speakers and they ask you a question, you'll find yourself responding automatically without having to think, and that is fluency. So yeah, practice is a fundamental part of the process. And just as a final thing on that, on how immersion, or passive learning, active learning and practice complement each other, that's very relevant to how you remember what you learn. So, and what I mean by that is I don't want you to worry too much about remembering what you learn. Obviously, practice is very important. I'd recommend using at least one or two memory techniques we're going to cover for supplementing that, but also try not to worry, because immersion, or passive learning, active learning and practice all complement each other to reinforce what you're learning and what you're immersing in and what you're practicing. Just as a quick example, you'll often find that when you're immersing in Catalan, say you're on the commute to work and you're listening to Catalan radio, a certain word or phrase will suddenly leap out at you, even though it's passive, it will still leap out at you because the night before during your active learning you came across that phrase. And you'll often have moments like that during the process, and it's not only is it a nice feeling because it's a tangible feeling of progress, but also it's a very effective part of the process. It will really help you push on with the language. Now, to look at the guide in more detail, we'll go back to the table of contents. Now, after the overview, we've got Introduction to Catalan. Now, if you're wanting to use the guide as a reference tool, the only part of this which I'd recommend as sort of essential reading is the orientation, because that covers alphabet and pronunciation, which obviously is a fundamental part of learning any language. And in that part, you'll also find links to a series of videos by excellent YouTube channels for learning Catalan, which will, take you through the Catalan alphabet and pronunciation with audio, which obviously is an essential part of learning that. And then after that, I'd also recommend reading the Head Start. Now, in and of itself, it's probably not essential for learning Catalan. However, I would definitely recommend it because in that I explain about the huge amount of shared vocabulary between English and Catalan. And after reading this, you'll probably feel even more encouraged about the process and even more confident about it. So I definitely recommend reading it. And in that, I also briefly mentioned the historical reasons for that. But if you're into your history and you want to get an even deeper understanding of the Catalan language, then I'd recommend reading the history part of the guide, where I tell you about the history of the Catalan language. To research that, I read through a couple of books in Catalan by Catalan historians about the history of the language. Links to those can be found in the further reading part. And it's not essential, but I would recommend reading that to deepen your understanding of the Catalan language, and it will also just enrich the whole process. There will be moments during the process of learning Catalan where you come across stuff which you'll have read about the context of, historical reasons behind during this history part, and so it will really enrich the process and deepen your understanding of everything. Now, if you are wanting to read the history part but you're itching to get on with the rest of the process, then what I'd recommend doing is reading on with the rest of the guide and then coming back to the history part later once you're set up with your routine for learning Catalan. Now, we then move on to the settling in period, which lasts anywhere between a few days to a few weeks depending on your preference. And during that, all I want you to do really is just immerse in Catalan, just get used to the language. Now, the reason I recommend doing this at least for a few days, ideally for a week or two, is so that, before you start active learning and practice, you can really build up your familiarity with the sounds and the sound patterns of the language, so that, when you incorporate active learning and practice during the path to fluency, it's all just that much more familiar and easier and smoother to get started. Now, as an example for why I'd recommend that, if you think about if you went and started active learning and practice straight away without doing that, there's a chance that it might seem very unfamiliar and therefore a little bit daunting, a little bit overwhelming even, and that can affect your motivation if you're not careful. So I definitely recommend following the settling in period for at least a few days. If you're in a rush after a few days to, if you're itching to get on with the rest of the process, that's fine, don't worry, by all means do so. But if you're not in too much of a rush, then I would recommend just immersing in Catalan for, up to a few weeks if you feel like it. Now, we've got here resources for doing this immersion, and we've got a wide range like podcasts and radio, music, audiobooks, books, series and films, YouTube, news and articles, all with like various topics. You can find stuff you're interested in. And just as an example, if we go to YouTube, we start off with channels for learning Catalan, which obviously some of them do have good content for immersion, but their main thing will be great stuff for active learning. But beyond that, we have stuff for genuinely immersing in the language, such as, bit of everything, could be like vlogs, all sorts, health and lifestyle, cinema, entertainment, literature, current affairs and politics, education and science, and there's even here something about, language and literature of, well, it's a controversial topic, but the Valencian form of Catalan. Valencian people may choose to call it Valencian. yeah, I won't go into much detail on that because it's a controversial topic, but regardless of that, interesting stuff to immerse in there. And so, yeah, if we take an example, if we go to, say, BTV here, you can find different videos to immerse in on, all sorts of topics. So, a very helpful thing with YouTube especially, even though the algorithm can be a bit of a sinister concept at times, I get that, one benefit of it is that when if you find a channel here that you enjoy immersing in, YouTube will start to realise that you enjoy that sort of content and will start recommending similar channels, similar videos in Catalan about those sorts of things, so your immersion can really snowball in that sense. This is, could be especially helpful with Catalan because unfortunately, given that it isn't as widely spoken as languages like Spanish and Portuguese and so on, there aren't as many resources out there for learning it, but fortunately, because of the age we're living in, the amount of resources genuinely does increase, like almost by the day, certainly by the weeks and months. More and more people will be, starting a podcast in Catalan, starting, TikToks in Catalan, starting YouTube channels in Catalan and so forth. So you should be able to find enough resources to immerse in the language. And even though there perhaps isn't as great a variety as with other languages, there's still more than enough in terms of, the core channels and stuff mentioned, like, the news, podcasts and radio. As an example, I remember during my final year of university, I did a lot of dissertation research in different languages to research fascism in Europe during the 1930s. And so I was learning quite a few different languages during that final year in order to do that. And one of them was Catalan. And fortunately, I had the option of taking a module in Catalan during that year, where we had an amazing teacher from Catalonia who almost only spoke to us in Catalan during the lessons, so it was great immersion, aside from active learning. But also one thing I always did was, despite not having as wide a variety of resources to choose from, literally almost every morning for a few months, in the shower and on, walking to campus, walking to work in, the afternoon and the evening, I would listen to a Catalan news podcast every day, and that helped a lot as well. So even if there isn't as much variety, you can still get loads of immersion either way. Now, after the settling in period, you move on to the path to fluency, which is where you incorporate active learning and practice. Now, to start with, we cover passive learning in more detail, just to help you get more out of passive learning during the process. For example, tips and techniques like just changing the device or the language of your devices or your phone to Catalan so that you get even more immersion each day automatically, stuff like that. Then we go into active learning in even more detail. And if you are wanting to use this as a reference tool, don't worry, we've got overview of active learning here where you've got the essential bullet points for active learning. But beyond that, we then go into more detail about sentence collecting, the free and paid resources you can use. On that, the difference mainly is usually time rather than quality. Paid resources are sometimes arranged for you to save you a bit of time, but the quality between free and paid is usually similar, if not the same actually. So just, choose whichever you prefer. Sentence creating is just, when you're sentence collecting, swap out a word and throw in another word to make a new sentence. It's a very helpful part of the process. Will build up your confidence in using the language, will give you more phrases to learn. The only caveat to mention is that you should, be sure to use these phrases in conversation with Catalan speakers during your practice so that you can get feedback, because not every sentence you create will be, a phrase or sentence people would actually use, and that's fine. Don't worry at all about, making mistakes in inverted commas. It's an essential part of the process, so please, don't even think of it in terms of mistakes. It's just a part of the process, very important, and nothing to worry about. And besides, a lot of the sentences you create will be useful, will be stuff that Catalan speakers would say, so don't worry. Now, active listening and reading, as mentioned, that can just help make sentence collecting a bit more interesting and engaging should you wish. So we cover the theory here, as well as all the different mediums and resources you can use to do that. How to remember what you learn are some of the memory techniques you can use to supplement the process. I'd recommend choosing one or a couple depending on what you prefer. There's SRS mentioned here, which are spaced repetition systems, like stuff like Anki, flashcard software, which you may be familiar with. Now, if you enjoy using those, by all means use them, they can be effective, but if you don't, please don't feel any pressure to use them. They're, a big deal's made of them on YouTube usually, but they aren't essential, I promise. For example, I just used a notebook as a memory technique for my active learning when learning Vietnamese. You could use a diary, voice memos, chorusing, which also happens to be a great way to improve your pronunciation as well. And then we've got practice, where we cover different forms of practice, audio messages, calls or typed conversations, apps you can use like Tandem or HelloTalk. Now, of course, if you're lucky enough to be living in Catalonia or a Catalan speaking region, or have Catalan expat communities nearby, then hopefully you'll get a chance to practice in person and be able to practice even more. But just use the apps if that's all you've got available to you. That's no problem. Now, in terms of putting it all together, you'll just learn how to put all this together into a routine, basically, for learning the language, how to plan forward. Now, on that, don't be disheartened when, inevitably during the process you will have to be flexible and adjustable with your plans, because, our daily schedules, or, our schedules, our lives always evolve, always change, from month to month, week to week, even sometimes day to day. So our plans for learning a language also have to adapt accordingly, and that's fine. Just remember to be flexible, and it can be frustrating, especially when you've been in a really good rhythm with learning the language, but it's part of the process. It will happen, so try not to be too disheartened, and just be flexible. As an example, I just tend to use something like Apple Notes to keep a very basic plan of some things I might want to immerse in over the coming weeks, and what I'm going to actively learn over the coming days and weeks, maybe even month at most. And because it's quite basic, I can adjust it very easily as my schedule changes during that time. You will see very fancy, elaborate Notion templates and spreadsheets on YouTube, and if you enjoy doing that, by all means do that, that's fine. But if you don't enjoy that sort of thing, please don't feel you have to go into that level of granular detail, because people who do that, they end up having to change it anyway, because, as I said, people's lives and schedules evolve over time anyway. Now, we then move on to what next, which basically just shows you how to keep improving beyond fluency, which basically just comes down to continuing practicing with Catalan speakers and immersing in the language. To really go up a level, I'd recommend learning about Catalan culture, history, society, to really bridge that gap to the proficiency of first language speakers, because you'll be able to talk in a way that they would about such topics if you look into those things. This here is just about getting your Catalan certified, should you wish to, and then we finish with some tutorials which you can just dip into as and when you need them, such as how to add audio to flashcards if you're using flashcards. Overcoming challenges, I'd recommend reading that whenever you're feeling your motivation dipping a bit, or you think you might need to take a bit of a break from learning the language because of other commitments. And then how to learn 2 languages at once I've included, just because people often find once they've learnt a language, they've enjoyed it so much they want to learn other languages, so that part will show you how to go about doing that, should you wish to. And then images, there's quite a lot of images in the book, and you might think, after seeing some of them, you might want to visit there if you get the chance in future, that sort of thing. So here you can find where they are and who took the photo, through Unsplash. And then, for contact, please feel free to contact me at any point. If you've got any questions, you can email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info, and I'll get back to you promptly. I'd be more than happy to help, so please feel free to get in touch. And then just finally with reviews, if you enjoyed the ebook, please feel free to let me know. I'd be delighted to hear your feedback. You can do so either on the reviews page on the website or by emailing me. I'd be delighted to hear from you. So that covers everything really. As I said, if you have any questions, please do let me know, and enjoy learning Catalan.